For thousands of years, civilizations rose and flourished in regions where water was abundant. Rivers provided irrigation. Rainfall nourished fields. Communities grew into cities, and cities into empires. But this prosperity depended on environmental stability. When that stability shifted, the consequences unfolded slowly, over generations. Drought was among the most persistent challenges ancient societies faced. Unlike floods or storms, which came and went, droughts could last for years, or even decades. They did not announce themselves with sudden destruction. Instead, they arrived quietly, reducing harvests season after season, until the strain became impossible to ignore. In Mesopotamia, civilization emerged in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Farmers developed irrigation channels to direct water across fields. Surplus grain supported growing populations and allowed specialization in crafts and administration. But this system required consistent river flow. When prolonged droughts reduced water levels, the irrigation networks became less effective. Fields that once produced abundant crops yielded less. Granaries that had stored surplus began to empty. As agricultural output declined, the economic foundation of these cities weakened. Farmers struggled to pay taxes in grain. Temples and palaces, which redistributed food and organized labor, found their resources diminishing. Public works projects slowed. Maintenance of canals and infrastructure became sporadic. The administrative systems that had coordinated thousands of people began to lose their capacity to function. Evidence from the Indus Valley civilization tells a similar story. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro featured advanced urban planning, with covered drainage systems and organized streets. These settlements thrived for centuries, supported by agricultural surplus from the surrounding region. But sediment analysis and climate records suggest that monsoon patterns began to shift around 4,000 years ago. As rainfall became less predictable, the agricultural base contracted. Farmers may have struggled to maintain the same level of production. Trade networks that had connected distant regions began to shrink as surplus goods disappeared. Research points to a gradual depopulation of urban centers, with people possibly migrating toward areas with more reliable water sources. The cities were not destroyed. They were slowly abandoned as the systems that sustained them eroded. In the Maya lowlands of Central America, drought played a significant role in the transformation of classical Maya civilization. Between the 8th and 10th centuries, evidence indicates multiple severe dry periods. The Maya had developed sophisticated water management, including reservoirs and channels to capture and store rainwater. These systems worked well under normal conditions, but extended droughts pushed them beyond their capacity. When stored water ran out and fields dried, food became scarce. Historians suggest that social tensions may have increased as resources dwindled. The elaborate political structures that had coordinated labor and ritual activities began to weaken. Major urban centers saw declining populations. Construction of monumental architecture ceased. The network of city-states that had defined Maya civilization fragmented. The pattern was similar across different regions and time periods. Drought created stress that compounded over time. A single year of poor rainfall could be endured. Communities had strategies for managing short-term scarcity. But when droughts persisted, those strategies became insufficient. Stored reserves depleted. Trade partners faced their own shortages. The margin for error disappeared. Administrative complexity became a burden under these conditions. Systems designed to manage abundance struggled to adapt to scarcity. Officials accustomed to distributing surplus found themselves managing deficits. Record-keeping and taxation, once tools of coordination, became sources of friction as people had less to give. The institutions that had enabled growth now faced challenges they were not structured to solve. Some societies attempted to adapt. They changed agricultural practices, sought new water sources, or relocated populations. But adaptation required resources and time. It demanded coordination at precisely the moment when coordination became most difficult. When environmental stress persisted for decades, Even the most organized societies found their resilience tested beyond its limits. The social fabric itself began to fray under prolonged scarcity. Communities that had cooperated for generations found themselves competing for diminishing resources. Skilled artisans and laborers, no longer supported by agricultural surplus, may have abandoned their crafts. The specialization that had created cultural and technological advancement became difficult to sustain. Markets that had once bustled with trade grew quieter as fewer goods moved between regions. Population movement became a response when local conditions became untenable. Evidence suggests that people migrated in search of more favorable environments. These movements were likely gradual, with families and small groups departing over years rather than entire populations fleeing at once. As people left, the labor force necessary to maintain complex infrastructure diminished further, creating a cycle that accelerated decline. Archaeological records show that collapse was rarely complete or sudden. People did not disappear. They dispersed into smaller communities, returned to less complex forms of organization, or merged with neighboring groups. What ended was not human presence, but the particular configuration of institutions, infrastructure, and social structures that had defined the civilization. The decline of these early civilizations reveals a fundamental pattern. Societies are systems built on environmental foundations. When those foundations shift slowly, the effects accumulate gradually. Economic strain leads to institutional weakness. Institutional weakness reduces the capacity to respond to further challenges. Each stress makes the system more vulnerable to the next. Drought affected early civilizations not through a single catastrophic event, but through the steady erosion of the conditions that had made complex society possible. The evidence, though sometimes incomplete, suggests a process of gradual decline rather than sudden collapse. These were not failures of leadership or will, but the outcome of environmental pressures that exceeded the adaptive capacity of the systems in place. The great cities fell silent, not because they were conquered, but because the circumstances that had sustained them slowly, inexorably, changed.